I was plating up barbecue for a National Guard sergeant when the tow truck's hook dropped like a guillotine onto my food truck's front bumper. The timing couldn't have been worse. Behind me, firefighters waited in line for hot meals after a 14-hour shift pulling kids from floodwaters. A paramedic was still handing me a handwritten thank you note when Karen from the HOA showed up with arms crossed and a smirk on her lips. She'd called the tow company on me. No warning. No conversation. Just a smug look like she'd just cleaned gum off her shoe. My generator was still humming. My grill was still hot. And the line of hungry, exhausted disaster workers stretched around the cul-de-sac. But none of that mattered to Karen. Not the state of emergency. Not the food in mid-prep. She pointed to her clipboard and barked over the noise like she was leading a kindergarten field trip. According to her, my food truck violated HOA Rule 6.3.2 about unregistered commercial vehicles. I told her this wasn't a hot dog stand at a fair. This was an emergency deployment. She just rolled her eyes and said, "Well, it's not my emergency." It had started 3 days earlier when the storm rolled in out of nowhere. Meteorologists had called it a passing thunder cell, but by the time it was over, it had dumped 9 inches of rain and knocked out half the town's infrastructure. Roads were blocked. Power lines were down. Families were trapped in their homes. The official shelters were overwhelmed. That's when I decided to fire up the roaming soldier, my food truck. It wasn't just a business to me. I had served in the military as a cook and transitioned into civilian life by starting a mobile kitchen certified for emergency food distribution. The truck was equipped with a 72-hour generator, satellite GPS, and even backup solar panels. This wasn't my first emergency, but it was the first time I'd parked in my own neighborhood to help. People came running. EMTs who hadn't eaten in 12 hours. Families whose kitchens had flooded. Cops on patrol. I served hot meals and clean water, refused payment, and kept the line moving. The community was grateful. Even Channel 7 News did a spot on me. That's probably what triggered Karen. See, she'd always had an issue with me. Ever since I moved into the community, she kept finding reasons to write me up. My grass was 1/8 of an inch too tall. My trash bin was placed on the curb 6 minutes too early. But this time, she went nuclear. By the time I realized what she was doing, the tow truck had already lifted the front wheels. I sprinted out with a box of donated granola bars in one hand, asking what the hell was going on. The driver looked apologetic, but said he had orders. Karen, standing smugly behind him, pointed at a section in the HOA handbook about unauthorized commercial use of residential property. I told her this wasn't commerce. This was community service. But she doubled down, claiming I was disturbing the neighborhood peace. The only disturbance happening was the guttural groan of tired firemen who'd been waiting for warm food. I offered to show Karen the state emergency certification I kept laminated in the truck. She waved it away like it was a menu from a pizza joint. The truck was towed down the street, and I watched helplessly as my mobile kitchen, my livelihood and lifeline for others, was hauled away. The crowd that had gathered began murmuring. A nurse named Jenna, who lived 3 doors down, confronted Karen directly. She asked if she had no compassion, no common sense. Karen just huffed and said she was maintaining order. The worst part? Less than an hour later, Karen had a catering van pull up to the same spot and start unloading food for an HOA brunch scheduled for that afternoon. Same type of vehicle. No tow. No clipboard. Just catered fruit and smug laughter. Retrieving my food truck from impound was another insult. The tow company claimed they were just following orders but still charged me a $2,000 fee. When I asked to see documentation, the manager handed me a form that had Karen's signature and a note referencing HOA Enforcement Authority. They'd clearly towed the truck under false pretense. But unless I wanted to sue, which would take months, I had to pay to get it back. I handed over my credit card and drove off with my truck rattling from the rough treatment, my hands shaking in frustration. On the way home, I stopped by the fire station. The chief came out, took one look at me, and said, "They got you too, huh?" The word was already spreading. Karen's interference hadn't just affected me. A few fire units had to delay response time because they went looking for meals that were no longer there. A police officer told me off record that they were considering filing a formal complaint, but politics were tricky. The HOA had powerful lawyers. Karen's husband was some regional bank VP with connections. They couldn't act without more proof. But I had other plans. The moment I got home, I started digging. I pulled every document related to HOA rules. I called the city clerk's office to get property use codes. I emailed my FEMA contact to get legal documentation of my emergency status. That night I couldn't sleep. Not just from the anger, but from the sense that if I let this slide, it would become the new normal. Karen wasn't just a busybody, she was dangerous. She had interfered with disaster relief and jeopardized lives over a personal vendetta. And worse, she was unrepentant. I knew she'd be back with more tricks. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to do it publicly, legally, and with enough evidence to burn her whole operation down. The next morning, I parked my truck legally just outside HOA limits, in the lot of a small local church that supported relief work. The moment I flipped the open sign back on, the lines started forming again. Firefighters, police officers, linemen restoring the power grid, families with small children. They returned not just for the food, but because they knew what I stood for now. And so did Karen. From her porch, she stared across the street at the line of people I was feeding, her jaw clenched so tightly you could see it from the other side of the cul-de-sac. Then the media showed up. Again. And this time, I told them everything. On camera. From the first day I parked the truck, to the moment it was hauled away while EMTs stood waiting, to the evidence of her personal brunch with a catering van that faced no consequences. The reporter's eyes widened. "So you're saying the HOA towed an emergency food truck during a declared disaster to make room for a private brunch?" I just nodded. I didn't need to dramatize it. The facts spoke for themselves. I ended that interview with a quiet statement. I said I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking not to be sabotaged while feeding the people keeping this community alive. And with that, the storm wasn't the only thing stirring up our quiet suburban street. Karen had no idea the blowback that was coming. But I was ready. Because this wasn't about me anymore. This was about everyone she had ever pushed around, fined, silenced, or harassed. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning. Karen thought she had won. She thought her clipboard, her bylaws, and her influence were enough to squash me like a bug under her designer heels. But what she failed to understand was that people were watching now. Not just the neighbors, who were whispering and gossiping louder by the hour, but reporters, first responders, and the city itself. And while Karen smugly sipped mimosas with her HOA cronies on her manicured lawn, I was back in action just across the street, legally parked on church property, and serving hot meals again. This time, there was something different in the air. The people coming to my truck weren't just hungry, they were angry. They had seen what happened, and they were quietly rallying behind me in the only way they knew how, with patience, loyalty, and word of mouth that spread faster than one of Karen's passive-aggressive emails. I served breakfast burritos to a lineman crew who had been restoring power since 4 a.m. One of them leaned in and told me the HOA president had blocked their access road the night before so her brunch wouldn't be disturbed. I raised an eyebrow and asked if that was reported. He just chuckled and said, "Not yet." But the stories were adding up. I heard from a school nurse that Karen had once fined her for parking an ambulance too close to the mailbox cluster. A retired veteran told me she'd tried to evict his support dog for being too large. I wasn't just dealing with a grumpy neighbor, I was dealing with a tyrant with a spreadsheet and no soul. The real shift came when the power went out again. A rolling blackout hit the neighborhood late that afternoon, plunging half the subdivision, including Karen's house, into darkness. Residents, many with kids or elderly parents, came out looking dazed and uncertain. The storm had already rattled them, and now they were without lights, internet, or working appliances. Guess who was still fully powered? My truck. I had solar backups, diesel reserves, and 2 industrial-grade generators. By nightfall, I had hung strings of LED lights around the lot and turned it into a makeshift hub. People brought lawn chairs and battery packs to charge. I kept the griddle hot and the kettle steaming. It felt less like a food stop and more like a small-town fair that had sprung out of necessity. That was when Karen crossed the street. She wasn't wearing her usual blazer or sunglasses. She looked tired, maybe even frazzled, but she still had that forced sense of superiority plastered across her face like stage makeup. She walked right past the families, ignored the handshake offered by a fire captain, and stepped up to my serving window like she was ordering at a drive-thru. I was mid-conversation with a nurse when she tapped her fingernails on the metal counter. I turned and greeted her politely, if cautiously. She said she wanted a vegan, gluten-free wrap with no oil, no soy, and extra avocado. I told her I didn't have that on the menu. She frowned like I had just told her I was serving gravel and tree bark. I explained, gently, that due to emergency rations, we were using shelf-stable ingredients and proteins that would last under fluctuating temperatures. She sneered and said, "I thought you cared about helping people." I looked at her, then at the 2 toddlers sitting on crates behind her, eating warm rice and beans with their mom, then back at her and said, "I do. Which is why I'm not wasting resources on luxury diets right now." She exploded. Loud enough that even the people 2 trucks away turned to look. She started yelling about discrimination, about service obligations, about how the HOA would be hearing about this. I let her finish her rant, not because I couldn't stop her, but because the silence that followed it was far more powerful. Nobody defended her. Nobody clapped. And the moment she realized the only sound around her was the quiet click of someone recording her with a phone, she turned and stormed off, face burning red. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't need to. One man in a fire jacket gave me a thumbs up. Another muttered, "About time." I didn't revel in it. I didn't need to. Karen had exposed herself far better than I ever could have. But the backlash wasn't over. The next morning, a zoning inspector showed up at my truck. Clipboard in hand, official badge clipped to his collar. He said someone had filed a complaint about an illegal commercial operation on church property. I asked if it came from the HOA. He didn't say it directly, but the shrug gave it away. I invited him to inspect everything. He stepped in, checked the sanitation logs, inspected my water filtration system, verified my emergency food distribution license, and even sampled a breakfast taco. When he stepped out, he smiled and said, "You're more compliant than half the restaurants I check. No violations here." And then he added, "I'm having a chili cook-off next week for first responders. You should come." I thanked him and turned back to my work, but I was already thinking ahead. Karen had tried to get me shut down again and failed. But she wouldn't stop. She never did. So I shifted strategy. I reached out to the city councilwoman whose campaign I had once catered for. I asked her what the rules were about temporary emergency sites and community service exemptions. She sent me a folder of documentation and said, "If you want to file a formal emergency operation permit, I'll endorse it personally." I filled it out that night. The following afternoon, Channel 7 News returned for a follow-up. This time, I gave them the full story. The original tow. The sabotage. The complaint. The retaliation. The outburst. They aired it with split screens. On one side, footage of me handing warm food to a 6-year-old with a teddy bear, and on the other, Karen yelling about avocado wraps with her nose in the air. The story went viral. Not just local viral, regional viral. My social media lit up. Donations poured in. Messages of support came from firefighters, nurses, teachers, even a local National Guard unit. One message came from a sergeant who wrote, "My guys said you kept them fed during the worst part. Thank you." That meant more than any news headline. But Karen wasn't done. The next day, I woke up to find my generator cords cut. Not just cut, slashed, frayed, and tossed into the bushes. I knew instantly it was her. No one else would know where to find them or have the motive. But this time, I had installed a backup camera. One that streamed to a private cloud server. I pulled the footage, and there she was. Hoodie over her head, but unmistakable posture. The way she walked, the angle of her stride. And at one point, she looked right into the lens. It was enough. I called the police. They didn't arrest her right away. But they took the footage seriously. And they began building a case. Tampering with emergency equipment during a state of disaster isn't just a fine. It's a criminal offense. When the officer left, he said, "Don't worry. We're not letting this one go." I nodded, but inside I was boiling. She had escalated from fines to sabotage. And while I wasn't interested in revenge, I was absolutely committed to justice. And maybe just a little poetic exposure. Because Karen had underestimated something important. Not just me, but the community. The people who watched her pull that stunt. The people she thought she could control with citations and HOA newsletters. Those same people were now lining up outside my truck, not just to eat, but to stand with me. And I was only getting started. By the time the sun rose on day 5, my food truck was more than a kitchen on wheels. It had become a symbol. Not just of resilience or neighborly service, but of resistance against petty tyranny. And Karen, for all her manicured control and laminated rules, couldn't stand it. She watched from across the street with binoculars she didn't bother hiding anymore. She had been publicly humiliated, outmaneuvered, and caught on video tampering with critical equipment during a disaster, yet somehow, in that strange way only the entitled can manage, she convinced herself she was still the victim. The cut generator cords had barely been replaced before her next scheme kicked into gear, and this time, she upped the stakes. She called in the health department. I was halfway through serving breakfast to a group of Red Cross volunteers when 2 inspectors showed up, clipboards in hand and polite but stern expressions on their faces. They introduced themselves, said there had been a formal complaint, and requested to do a full inspection of the vehicle and prep area. I invited them in without hesitation. I knew my truck better than I knew my own living room. It was spotless. Everything was labeled, dated, temperature logged, cross-contamination proof. I didn't cut corners, especially not when feeding people whose bodies were already worn down by stress and exposure. One inspector nodded with approval at the state-of-the-art sanitation station. The other asked where my water was coming from. I showed him the backup filtration system and sealed containers. They asked about food storage and supply chain. I showed them the certified emergency provision forms from my supplier, including FEMA endorsements. After 30 minutes, one of them leaned out of the truck and said to the other, "This is textbook." They finished up, signed the compliance report, and even stayed for coffee and a biscuit. Before leaving, one of them told me, off the record, that the complaint came with a weird stack of photos, including one of me handing food to a firefighter with the words "unlicensed seller" scribbled across the page in Sharpie. I didn't need to guess who sent it. I just thanked them, waved goodbye, and turned back to the grill. Karen had tried to weaponize the system again and had come up short, again. But this wasn't just a game of swatting flies. She was actively trying to destroy something that was helping people, and every time she failed, she got more creative. 2 days later, 3 members of the HOA board showed up at the church lot while I was prepping for lunch. They were noticeably more sheepish than Karen ever was. One of them, Greg, wore a faded polo and looked like he hadn't slept well. He said they'd like to speak to me privately. I wiped my hands and stepped outside. That's when they dropped the real bombshell. Apparently, Karen had filed a motion within the HOA to have me declared a neighborhood nuisance. Not just my truck, but me. She was trying to invoke a clause buried in the bylaws that allowed for removal of residents whose behavior materially disrupts the integrity or peace of the community. Greg said most of the board was reluctant, but Karen had managed to get 2 of them on her side with threats of legal exposure if they didn't support her. I asked what they expected me to do. They looked at each other, then one of them said, "Honestly? We were hoping you'd just move." I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure out if they were serious. Then I laughed. I didn't mean to. It just came out, dry and bitter. "Move?" I asked. "Because I'm feeding disaster workers during a blackout?" Greg raised his hands and said it wasn't personal. I told him it was absolutely personal, and it was going to get a whole lot more public if they kept pushing. That evening, I reached out to a local news contact who had been following my story since day one. I asked if they were interested in covering an HOA trying to evict a food truck operator mid-crisis. The journalist's response was instant. Within hours, I was on camera again, this time standing in front of the very lot where dozens of people were gathering for meals. The footage cut between me talking about emergency food access and shots of Karen yelling in a previous segment. The story went live by morning. And suddenly everything shifted. People who had never spoken to me before stopped by the truck to shake my hand. Kids brought drawings. One woman dropped off a full tray of donated pastries with a note that read, "Thank you for standing your ground." Karen's supporters, what few she had left, went radio silent. But not Karen. She resurfaced 2 days later with a new plan. She formed a community action group, called Neighbors for Neighborhood Purity, and began circulating flyers accusing me of being part of a secret commercial food network exploiting natural disasters for profit. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The flyer had doctored images, including one of me supposedly accepting cash behind the truck. The bill in the photo was clearly from a staged handoff I had done during a TV demonstration on safe food donations. I recognized the guy in the background. He was a reporter. It was absurd, but now it was libel. I consulted a lawyer. She looked at the flyer and said, "If you want to sue her, we have a solid case." I told her I didn't want money. I wanted it to stop. The lawyer smiled and said, "Sometimes the best way to make that happen is to let everyone see how deep the rot goes." I agreed. And then I set my next plan into motion. By this time, I had compiled an impressive file. Photos, videos, reports, even a sworn statement from a lineman who'd witnessed Karen block an ambulance access lane because she was upset about the noise. I submitted the file to the city's code enforcement office along with a formal complaint. Not about her as a neighbor, but as a public safety risk. The city opened an inquiry. Karen's house was visited 3 times in 1 week. I heard through the grapevine that her brunch caterer had been fined for operating without a license. The HOA board, facing mounting pressure, scheduled a vote to review her leadership. The real moment of satisfaction came a few days later. A kid, maybe 9 or 10, walked up to my truck holding a sketchbook. He handed it to me and flipped it open to a page with a cartoon drawing of me in a cape, serving soup to a superhero firefighter. He said, "My dad says you're a real hero." I thanked him, gave him a free churro, and watched him skip off toward his parents, who nodded at me from the sidewalk. That moment, that small, unexpected burst of kindness, meant everything, because it reminded me why I hadn't backed down. It reminded me why I was still standing there after all the sabotage, the false complaints, the libel, and the threat. Karen had thrown every weapon she had at me. Bureaucracy, lies, legal threats, social pressure. But what she failed to understand was that I didn't stand alone. The community she tried to control had chosen a different side. Not because I was perfect, but because they'd seen what she really was. And I had just begun pulling the curtain back. By the end of the 2nd week, the entire neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Karen was no longer just an annoyance or a local joke. She was a story. A full-blown, multi-part saga that was now spreading beyond our zip code. And the spotlight wasn't fading. If anything, it was getting brighter. I didn't ask for this war, but she had declared it, and now the entire community was watching the battle unfold like it was a primetime drama. Except this one didn't need a script. The absurdity wrote itself. I had planned to keep my head down and just keep feeding people, but the momentum had shifted. People were angry, not just at Karen, but at the way power was being abused right under their noses. So when the local news station asked if I'd be willing to sit down for a more detailed, in-depth piece, I agreed. They didn't want a puff piece. They wanted names, footage, background. They wanted to show what happened when a community leader used her authority to suppress relief efforts for personal control. The segment aired on a Thursday evening right after the weather report. What followed over the next 24 hours changed everything. The segment started with the original tow, the food truck hooked mid-service as first responders waited in line. It played the security footage of Karen cutting my generator cord, followed by photos of her catered brunch on the same sidewalk she claimed I was illegally parked on. It interviewed residents, nurses, police officers, even a city sanitation worker who said she fined him for having noisy equipment while clearing a storm drain. Then came the video of Karen shouting at me for not offering a gluten-free vegan wrap. The anchor's tone was professional, but even he couldn't help but shake his head as the words came out. By the time the story ended, there wasn't a shred of doubt about who Karen was, or what she had tried to do. The fallout was instant. I woke up the next morning to a line that stretched all the way to the end of the block. Neighbors brought folding chairs. Kids drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk that said "Thank you, food hero." Firefighters left a signed helmet on my window. A retired Marine left an envelope with $200 and a note that simply said, "Don't stop." But the most telling reaction came from Karen herself. That morning, she didn't come outside. Her porch was empty. Her shutters were closed. For the first time since this all began, her kingdom was quiet. But I knew better than to think silence meant surrender. Sure enough, she resurfaced later that day during the emergency HOA board meeting called in response to the broadcast. It was held at the clubhouse, which had never been so packed. Even people from other neighborhoods showed up, curious to see how this was going to unfold. Karen tried to walk in like nothing had happened, hair perfectly sprayed, pearls clasped neatly around her neck. But the whispers followed her like shadows. The board president, a man named Owen, looked like he was holding back a migraine. He opened the meeting by addressing the video footage, the city complaint, and the numerous emails they had received from both residents and officials. Then he asked Karen if she wanted to respond. She did. Oh, she absolutely did. She launched into a tirade about misinformation, media manipulation, and how I had orchestrated a smear campaign against her. She accused me of staging the footage, claimed the news station was in on it, and even insisted the kids drawing hearts on the sidewalk were planted by activist parents. The room sat in stunned silence. For a brief moment, you could hear the distant hum of my food truck's generator from across the street. Then someone from the back stood up. It was Jenna, the nurse who had confronted Karen on the day of the tow. She said loud and clear, "I was there. He didn't stage anything. He was feeding a paramedic when you had him towed." Others joined in. A lineman, a school principal, even a pastor. They all told stories. Real ones. Each one chipped away at the illusion Karen had tried to protect. And the more people spoke, the more her face tightened. By the end of the testimonies, she looked like she was about to combust. Then Owen asked for a board vote. They weren't removing her from the HOA completely. Not yet, but they were voting on whether she should be suspended from her leadership position pending formal investigation into abuse of authority and community harassment. The vote passed. 4-1. Karen was out, at least temporarily. She stood there, frozen, blinking like she hadn't calculated that outcome. When someone suggested she step down gracefully, she muttered something about lawyers and stormed out. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Her exit was its own form of justice. But I wasn't done. That same evening, I organized a thank you cookout for the entire community. I paid for everything myself: burgers, hot dogs, veggie wraps, water, snacks, music. I called it Feed the Block, and set up donation jars for emergency responders' families affected by the storm. I didn't make a single dime that night, but the return was bigger than any paycheck. Families danced. Officers brought their kids. The mayor's aide even stopped by and handed me a framed letter of civic recognition. But the moment that hit me the hardest came when an older woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her husband was a veteran who hadn't left the house in days due to PTSD triggered by the storm. But he came out tonight, because he felt safe here. And that's when it hit me. This fight with Karen, as ridiculous and exhausting as it had been, wasn't just about codes or permits or HOA bylaws. It was about creating a space where people felt seen and valued, especially in times of crisis. Karen had been trying to shrink that space, control it, gate it off for her idea of what a neighborhood should look like. But the people had spoken, and their version of community looked a whole lot different. Later that night, I stood beside my truck watching the last families pack up. The lights twinkled above like stars tangled in string. I thought about everything that had happened, the towing, the sabotage, the threats, the insults, and realized I felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because I wasn't fighting alone anymore. Karen had all the rules, but I had the people, and now the people had a voice. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to disappear without one final act. People like her never just retreat. They simmer. They calculate. And they look for the one weak spot you didn't protect. So I started preparing. Quietly. Carefully. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was setting up insurance. Because if she came for me again, I wasn't just going to block the blow. I was going to turn it into a victory. The cookout ended with a slow cheer as I handed the last meal to a tired mom with a sleeping child in her arms. As she walked away, I looked back at my truck, the same one that had nearly been destroyed, and smiled. Karen had started this thinking she could erase me with a tow truck. But all she had done was pave the road for something bigger. And she didn't even know what was coming next. The final blow didn't come with a bang. It came with a piece of paper. Thin, unassuming, delivered in a plain envelope by a city clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. It was Karen's last attempt to reclaim her imaginary throne. A cease and desist letter wrapped in legal-sounding threats and dripping with the tone of someone who thought they were still in control. It accused me of operating an unlicensed commercial business on religious property, violating traffic codes, disturbing neighborhood peace, and, my personal favorite, creating a public nuisance by encouraging social gatherings without proper HOA clearance. It was laughable, desperate, but also dangerous if not handled properly. That's how people like Karen operated. When public shaming and sabotage failed, they turned to legal scare tactics, hoping the cost of defense would outweigh the will to fight. What she didn't know was that I had already taken care of that. After the third sabotage attempt, I had begun digging deeper into the HOA's original charter, with the help of a paralegal who happened to be a regular customer. Buried beneath pages of dated bylaws was a rarely used clause labeled Community Emergency Accommodation, Section 9, Clause 7. It stated that in times of state-declared disaster, residential restrictions were superseded by municipal or federal emergency needs, especially in matters of food distribution, temporary shelter, and relief services. In simple terms, if I had an emergency operations permit, the HOA couldn't touch me. And thanks to the city councilwoman who'd been quietly cheering me on, I had that permit. Official, stamped, and already filed at City Hall. So when I opened that envelope and read through the threats, I didn't panic. I didn't even flinch. I just printed out a copy of the emergency ordinance, highlighted the relevant sections, and attached it to my own response. Then I mailed it to her attorney and copied every member of the HOA board, the city clerk, the mayor's liaison, and the local news. I included a brief statement that read, "As the holder of an active emergency food distribution permit during a state-recognized disaster recovery period, I am operating in full compliance with municipal and federal law. Any further attempts to obstruct this service will be considered interference with authorized disaster relief operations. The next morning, her attorney withdrew the letter and apologized for the miscommunication. Karen, unsurprisingly, made no comment. But I knew she was fuming. At this point, the community wasn't just supportive. They were galvanized. People started showing up not only to eat but to volunteer. A retired electrician fixed my backup power line. A group of teens painted signs for the truck. Heroes eat here, community first, and even a mock movie poster titled Karen vs. The Kitchen. A police sergeant dropped off a stack of witness statements related to the sabotage, all ready for submission should I decide to press charges. But I wasn't interested in dragging this through the courts unless absolutely necessary. My strategy had always been transparency and documentation. And now it was time to take it one step further. I organized a second community event, this one in partnership with the local fire station, the Red Cross, and a few small businesses that had reached out in support. We called it Relief Rally, and it wasn't just a cookout. It was a city-permitted block gathering, fully compliant and covered by local sponsorships. We offered free meals, first aid kits, mental health resources, and live music. The mayor showed up to give a brief speech and handed me a civic commendation for extraordinary service during times of crisis. And just like that, everything Karen had accused me of became the foundation for my recognition. Of course, Karen didn't attend. She watched from behind her curtains as families lined the sidewalks, as a jazz trio played upbeat tunes, and as her once quiet cul-de-sac became a vibrant community center. And while she sulked in the shadows of her collapsing authority, I served burgers to nurses, handed lemonade to toddlers, and gave interviews to journalists who couldn't believe this entire saga started with a tow truck. The rally ended with a group photo. Everyone who had pitched in, volunteered, or supported the effort. The fire captain stood next to me, arms slung over my shoulder, while the photographer captured the moment. Karen's house, dim and shuttered, sat in the background like a forgotten monument to control gone wrong. But the best twist came a week later, when the city council finally concluded their review of the HOA's conduct during the declared emergency period. They ruled that several HOA actions, including Karen's leadership during the incident, constituted violations of both city code and public safety protocols. As a result, the HOA was stripped of its discretionary enforcement power until new leadership could be elected, and Karen was officially barred from holding any HOA position for the next 5 years. The ruling was read publicly at a community meeting. She didn't show up to hear it, but someone live-streamed it, and her name trended locally for a full 24 hours. I didn't celebrate with a speech or throw a party. I celebrated by pulling into the same spot she had tried to claim during her brunch event, setting up my grill, and serving free meals to anyone who wanted one. No permits questioned. No tow trucks lurking. No threats. Just the smell of sizzling carne asada, the sound of kids laughing, and a long line of neighbors who no longer whispered about HOA drama but joked about it openly. The once tight grip Karen had on the neighborhood had turned into dust in the wind. But the final moment of satisfaction came unexpectedly. A tow truck pulled into the neighborhood. Not for me. For her. Karen had parked her golf cart, an oversized luxury model with chrome rims and built-in speakers, in a no-parking zone near the park entrance. She had always done it, and no one had ever enforced the rule because she was the enforcer. But now? The rules were actually being applied. The driver walked up, took a few photos, radioed dispatch, and began the process. As the lift engaged and the cart rose into the air, Karen came storming out of her house barefoot, bathrobe flapping in the wind, shouting about legal immunity and harassment. But this time, no one listened. A group of teenagers clapped. Someone from across the street yelled, "Let us know if you want a vegan wrap for the ride." She tried to argue with the tow truck driver, but he pointed to the sign, then to his city-issued ticket book, and said, "Sorry ma'am, I'm just doing my job." Watching her stand there, helpless and sputtering, while her custom golf cart was hauled away under the same authority she had once weaponized. It was poetic. I didn't gloat. I didn't record. I just turned the dial on my speaker and let music fill the air as I got back to work. In the end, I didn't win by yelling louder, suing faster, or attacking harder. I won by showing up, by feeding people, by staying calm, staying legal, and documenting everything. Karen had tried to rule with fear and paperwork, but I had built something she couldn't understand. A real community. Not one based on control, but on trust, on generosity, on shared struggle and shared laugh. And no matter how many rules she dug up or letters she mailed, she couldn't tow that away. So I kept cooking, kept serving. And every time someone new came to the truck, they'd ask, "Hey, are you the guy from the HOA food truck story?" And I'd smile, pass them a plate, and say, "Yep, that's me. The guy they tried to shut down while he was feeding heroes." And they always said the same thing. "Well, not anymore.